Hello and welcome back to the channel, everybody. I am your host, Vortex, from MobileMusicPro.com, your home for mobile music production. And if you are new to the channel, what we do here is release weekly videos teaching people how to produce music on their iOS device. And in today's video, we're going to be going over the most popular EQ plugin types right after this. And remember folks, if you do enjoy this content, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. Now, as we mentioned, we are going to be going through a bunch of these different EQ plugin types, but more specifically, we're going to be checking out why you'd want to use one over the other and the various drawbacks and benefits to each one. And in fact, we just recently covered how to use Cubasis 3's Studio EQ, so if you did want to go into a little bit more detail on what an EQ actually is and does, then definitely make sure to check out that video. And going even further, we have a few completely free mixing cheat sheets on our website that actually outlines exactly what frequencies most instruments use. So definitely make sure to check out that free PDF if you are looking to become even more precise with your EQ. But basically, as far as a high-level description goes, the EQ is short for equalizer and basically allows us to raise or lower the volume of specific frequencies so that we can shape our sound and get a better overall mix. Now, maybe you have seen a bunch of these different types of EQs out there and were just a little bit curious to figure out which one you should use at which time. But the truth is that a lot of this stuff is really based on personal preference and using your ears, so we can't exactly tell you what exact tool to use at any given time. You really have to take it on a case-by-case basis. However, with that being said, there are still some EQs that are better suited for certain tasks than others, and we'll show you exactly why. Alright, and now with that intro aside, let's start exploring some of these different EQ plugin types. Now real quick though, just before we get started, I just want to let you guys know that we will be demoing all of these different EQ plugins inside of our DAW of choice, which is Cubasis 3. But of course, every single DAW will have at least these EQ plugins and probably a lot more. Some of these EQs are designed to be used a little bit more surgically on specific sounds more in the beginning of your mix, while some of these other EQs are meant to apply more broad changes and are generally used on the mix as a whole. And finally, just something to keep in mind that when you are cutting frequencies, you generally cut them in a pretty narrow band, where when you're trying to boost frequencies, you generally boost them in more of a bell-like curve. Alright, now let's go ahead and get started talking about our very first EQ plugin, which is the Shelf EQ. Now, pretty much all of your various EQs are going to display the frequency range here towards the top. As you can see, we're starting out at around 100 Hz and going all the way up to 10K. And if you didn't know, the human ear can generally hear between 20 and 20,000 Hz. So you'll usually never see any EQs with any lower or higher frequency ranges than that. Now, shelf EQs aren't really meant to be super customizable. In fact, they're really meant to apply really soft and gentle curves, and generally only have a couple of dials on them. And in this particular case, you can see we only have the two faders here, one labeled bass and one labeled treble. And of course, sometimes these faders come in the form of knobs. It really just depends on the EQ. Now, all of the different audio loops that we'll be using today are going to be coming from our sample packs, which you can find at MobileMusicPro.com. And what I have first up here is a piano loop from our Genesis sample pack. And the first thing I'm going to do is demonstrate how to make this a little bit darker by increasing the bass, and then we're going to make it a little bit brighter by increasing the treble. So let's reset this back to 0 dB real quick by double tapping, and put on the headphones, and let's hit play. Alright, now in most cases today we are going to be demoing with extreme examples here so you can see what it actually sounds like when you make these changes. In most cases you won't be applying such drastic changes to your sound, so definitely make sure that you do keep that in mind. Now hopefully you did hear it get a little bit darker when we started to increase the bass and reduce the treble. And then of course when we did the opposite, it started to get brighter when we increased the treble and reduced the bass. And if we look over here in the studio presets from Steinberg, you can see that they already have some presets with these types of scenarios in mind. So if we tap on the business in the front, you can see how it immediately reduces the bass and increases the treble, because what the preset is trying to do is place more of those high frequencies in the front. And then if we check out another preset, for example, like Party in the Back, it does the exact opposite of the business in the front preset, where it increases the bass and reduces the treble. So let's reset this back to default and just click on a few of these presets so you can one more time hear what this EQ is doing. So definitely a pretty big difference there in the sound. And then when you start applying this technique to multiple instruments, you'll really be able to see a pretty drastic change in your overall mix. Alright, and the next EQ plugin that we'll be discussing today is the graphic or graphical EQ. And the graphic EQ that we'll be using for today's video is the EQ PG found inside of the Mixbox plugin on iOS. Now at first glance you might think, well, this isn't very much of a graphic EQ, because I don't really see any type of real-time displays of like the waveform or anything like that. But these really were one of the first EQs where you could actually visualize your EQ curve. So for example, if you were boosting a bunch of lows and boosting a bunch of lows like this and then take some highs over here, you'll actually be able to see that curve in real time. So you can see, for example, this EQ curve that we created. And these EQs started becoming really popular in the 60s and 70s before everybody started producing music on the computer. What you'll find with these types of EQs is that they have fixed frequencies for each one of these faders. So for example, this says 63, 125, 250, 500. I can't actually change that to 501, for example. However, the farther off center you are in these types of EQs, the greater the Q curve is. So if you just adjust the frequency just a little bit, the Q curve is actually going to be pretty small. But if you go all the way out here, then the actual EQ curve will be much wider and much broader. Now this particular graphic EQ has about 10 bands here and goes for between 31 and 16K. However, some EQs have a little bit more, some have a little bit less, it all just depends on the manufacturer. And finally, the last thing I want to say before we do an audio demonstration here of this plugin is that it comes in really handy when you're actually trying to undo various mistakes. And what do we mean by that? For example, if you recorded a guitar like a bass guitar or a rhythm guitar and you removed around 250 Hz right here, and then when you play it back in your DAW, you listen to the frequencies again and you realize, you know what, that was a bit of a mistake, I want to undo that a little bit. So then what you can simply do is place another EQ on top of that sound and increase the 250 instead of reducing it, effectively canceling out the change that you created with the EQ when it was recorded. Alright, now let's take a listen to hear what this EQ sounds like. What I'm going to do is just like before is play the audio loop first and then start messing with some of these frequencies. Alright, let's hit play. Alright, so what I did there was boost the 125 frequency range just a little bit to give it just a little bit more bass. And then I increased the mids here a little bit in the 500 frequency range. And then I reduced the frequencies in the 4K range a little bit to leave some room for some vocals and some other instruments. And then finally, I wanted to add a little bit more sheen and shine to this guitar, so I upped the frequency range just a tad in the 8K and 16K range. So now let's hear what this sounds like. First we'll turn it off, and then we'll turn it back on. Alright, definitely a fantastic sample from our synthwave sample pack. Now hopefully you did hear the changes in there as I disabled and enabled the EQ. The EQ changes definitely brought up the volume a little bit in the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies, and just a little bit in the mid-range as well, to the point to where when you disable the EQ, the guitar now sounds a little bit thin. But of course, this was just an example. It becomes a case-by-case basis because you really have to take in all sorts of different things into account, including the rest of the mix, the genre, the BPM, and so forth. Alright, now the third type of EQ plugin that we're going to be discussing today is the Parametric EQ. Now the Parametric EQs tend to be much more visually pleasing, and in fact we have the Studio EQ pulled up here inside of Cubasis 3, which is Cubasis's Parametric EQ. Now this type of EQ can do things that are simply not possible with the Graphic EQ or the Shelf EQ. And in fact, some would call this EQ the most powerful type of EQ because it really ends up being the most customizable in the end. Now as you can see here, Cubasis's EQ comes with 4 different bands that you can choose from. Each one of these different bands allowing you to choose a different filter type here and the actual Q curve here. So for example, we can enable this band or this filter here, and we can choose the different filter types by tapping on this arrow here. And as you can see, there's a number of different ones here, including this low cut or high pass filter. And then tapping it again will give us a high cut or a low pass filter. And then you can adjust this filter's Q or how steep the curve is with the button right next to it. And let's demonstrate this again with a bell curve filter over here. So we'll tap on and enable the second filter here. And by default, you can see this is set to a bell shape. And what we're going to do is drag this up a little bit. And then we're going to increase the Q or make the filter much more narrow. So let's do that now. There we go. We can make this as flat or as steep as we'd like. Using these types of steep curves really works well for notching out specific offending frequencies, which basically means this EQ is really good at making very precise, very surgical changes. And finally, it's important to note that these types of EQs, the parametric EQs, are often very clean and very transparent, and generally aren't used to apply additional color or texture to your sounds. Alright, let's reset this to the default filter and start playing around. Alright, as you can see there, first we applied a high cut or a low pass filter, slowly taking away all the highs, and then after that we applied a low cut or a high pass filter. And now let's just notch out a couple of different frequencies. Alright, there we go. So I removed a couple of frequencies that I didn't like here around the 500 Hz area and boosted a little bit here in the 2K area. Remember what we said, generally when you're cutting frequencies, you want to make that pretty steep. But when you're boosting frequencies, you want to make that a little bit more broad. And finally, let's just take a look at a couple different lead synth presets here that Steinberg has included with this plugin. So we'll go back to the beginning and let's scroll down here. There we go. As you can see, Steinberg has included 3 different synth lead presets and 3 different synth pad presets. So let's just try a couple of these since this is definitely a lead synth sound. Alright, as you saw there, some of these boosted the mids, some of these cut the mids. Again, it all depends on where you want the specific sound to sit in your overall mix. Alright, and finally the very last EQ type that we'll be looking at today is the dynamic EQ. Now the application that will be running this dynamic EQ in is the FabFilter Pro Q3. Now of course FabFilter isn't the only EQ out there with dynamic functionality, but this is definitely the one that we like to use the most. Now these types of EQs are very, very powerful and in fact have only become popular with the recent advent of the higher end computing processing power. Now what dynamic EQs allow you to do is set very specific adjustments based on the input signal. So for example, when the input crosses a specific threshold, the EQ will kick in. Now these EQs are very often used for de-essing vocals or removing frequencies that build up over time. So what we're going to do now is give you an example of how this works. So again, we are in the FabFilter Pro Q3 here, and we can just double tap anywhere to create a new band. Now once we've done that, we can tap on this little arrow and set this to dynamic. And now let's listen to this vocal and hear what this is doing.
I cannot believe what I heard when you told me to stay. I thought it was her, but I saw that you sent her away. I cannot believe what I heard when you told me to stay.
Alright, so as you saw, the EQ was jumping up and down there, and that's because it was engaging based on that input threshold. So again, it was only EQing out specific frequencies when that input hit a specific threshold. And as you saw, you can pretty much drag it anywhere that you want, and you can create as many of these as you'd like. So as you can hopefully see, these dynamic EQs start to open up a bunch more options that simply aren't possible with those old standard EQs. Alright, and now it's time again for our final thoughts. And if you are still rocking with us, then we just can't thank you enough for being here. And we especially can't thank those enough that are here every single Wednesday and Friday to watch our live streams and our live premieres. Now this video was designed for beginners, so we definitely tried to keep it pretty short and sweet for those that are still learning about the concepts of EQ. And we'd very much like to stress to new producers how important the use of EQ really is inside of your productions. Because once you do start to understand how to shape specific sounds and place instruments in specific frequencies, your mixes will start to jump right off your screen. And in fact, we do have a couple of EQ related tips in our brand new completely free guide that we released this week called 50 Quick Tips for Cubasis 3. And this guide goes really great when you pair it with our brand new completely free Cubasis 3 Beginner's Guide that we released just last week, so definitely make sure to check both of those out. And to celebrate the release of those two free guides, we held a contest where one of 3 lucky winners could be taking home a brand new shiny copy of Cubasis 3. So definitely congratulations to the winners. We have those displayed up here on the screen, and we have contacted you via email. Plus we'll be sharing the winners of this giveaway across all of our social media, so look out for that as well. So thanks again to everybody who entered the giveaway, and remember, if you didn't win, don't worry because we will be having a ton more giveaways and contests in the future. And if you do want to be kept up to date and informed about all of those giveaways and contests that we'll be having in the near future, then definitely make sure to sign up for our completely free mailing list at MobileMusicPro.com. And so until next time everybody, keep talking music and we'll see you later. Hey everybody, Vortex here, and if you're not aware yet, we now have over 100 fully edited mobile music tutorial videos. And we make music every single Wednesday live on our channel right inside of Cubasis on our iPad. Plus, we also have a bunch of free sample packs, guides, and more at our website at MobileMusicPro.com/free. And so if you are into that sort of thing, producing music on your iPhone or iPad, then definitely make sure to subscribe and check out the rest of the videos on the channel that we know you'll love.